Dr. David Weinberg, thank you for taking the time to speak to ONTV.
Sure.
You have produced two of the most detailed reports on Qataris funding terrorism in 2014 and another report in 2017.
Yes.
How bad is the situation today?
So the most current piece of information about what things are like today from the United States side is that the former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department for terror financing issues stepped down in January with the change in administrations here in Washington. But several weeks after he stepped down, he stated at a public conference that there are still terror financiers who are designated, meaning sanctioned by an international entity. Presumably he was referring either to the US or the United Nations in this regard, who are still operating openly and notoriously in Qatar. Additionally, the four states that are now taking action against Qatar most actively, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, issued a list of roughly 60 or 70 individuals and entities that they added to terror finance sanctions lists. And roughly 40 of those entities, according to the United Arab Emirates, were linked to both Qatar and Al-Qaeda.
President Trump stated that Qatar is a funder of terrorism at a very high level.
He did.
There's an unprecedented blockade today.
Yes.
Why now?
So there are several elements to why now. One of them is that President Trump came to the region and signaled a position where he wanted Muslim and Arab countries to tackle terrorism and extremism, saying to them, drive them out. He repeated this several times in his speech in Riyadh, drive them out. He's also very close with President Sisi. He's very close with the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So he's understandably sympathetic to what they have to say. In addition, the Financial Times newspaper recently reported that there was an alleged Qatari ransom payment for the return of roughly 24 Qatari citizens, some of whom were members of the royal family who had been taken hostage by, held hostage by Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, a US designated terrorist organization that is backed by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now, a number of different news outlets since those hostages released in April said that according to Iraqi sources or according to other sources with knowledge of the deal, there allegedly was a very large multi-million-dollar ransom payment for the release of those hostages. Some sources said it was to Kataib Hezbollah. Some sources said also to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, which is dominated by Al-Qaeda, possibly also to Ahrar al-Sham in Syria. But what the Financial Times added to this whole information was the day that the four states started this severing of relations with Qatar, and were followed by several other states as well. The Financial Times reported that according to the sources it cited, the ransom payment was bigger than anyone had previously reported, and that it was the straw that broke the camel's back in this breach with Qatar. The paper cited these sources saying that up to $1 billion was allegedly paid by Qatar as part of this deal, and citing its sources who made allegations that up to 700 million of those funds went to Qatar, went to Iran, and to 3 Iranian-backed proxy groups inside Iraq, and that the bulk of that, 400 million, went to Iran itself. So you can understand why this might have been the last straw for the Saudi government, which has listed the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist group for 3 years, but was less tough on the Brotherhood than Egypt or the United Arab Emirates until recently. But once this allegation was out there of funding Iran with hundreds of millions of dollars and funding Iranian-backed terrorist groups with over $100 million, this is, I think, what pushed it over the edge with Qatar and led to the current action.
It is not the first time that the Qataris have paid ransoms. You testified in a public hearing in Congress, and I read your report. You stated that isn't it kind of awkward that they're paying ransoms for Westerners who are not Qataris to groups like Jabhat al-Nusra?
So I should note that I don't have inside information as to whether Qatar did or did not pay any ransoms. But what I do know is that there is a very broad range of news reports, including from very credible papers and news wires, citing sources which allege that Qatar has paid ransoms. And in many of these instances, these papers or news wires are citing government officials, either from Middle Eastern governments or from Western governments. So there are a number of different episodes in which such sources have accused Qatar of paying ransoms to Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, as well as at least one instance in which Qatar was accused of paying a ransom, along with Oman, actually, accused of paying a ransom to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen for hostages. In Syria, the cases are quite numerous, and the allegations range from 7 figures in the dollars, or 8, or even in one instance allegedly 9. So this is a very large volume of alleged payments to al-Qaeda. And now it should be noted that Qatar's government denies ever paying such a ransom. But even in one of those instances, the Qatari foreign minister at the time, I think it was in 2014, during a speech at Princeton University, made a very striking remark. He said, first he said Qatar doesn't pay ransoms to terrorist groups, but he said if any country did, it would be supporting terrorism through the back door. And I agree with that part of the statement. Paying ransoms to terrorist groups is supporting terrorism through the back door. And any state that does it, including if any of these allegations against Qatar are true, of which there are many such allegations, then it's a very worrisome act and very counterproductive in the fight against terror.
The U.S. Department of Treasury designated Abdulrahman bin Umair al-Nuaimi, the former president of the Football Association in Qatar, and they stated in the report that he funded Al-Qaeda and ISI in Iraq for a decade for about $2 million a month. What do you know about him today?
So what the Treasury Department said about him was that it alleged that he had funded terrorism for roughly a decade, and that at times he had been funding, reportedly been funding Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which, as you know, is the predecessor to Daesh. I believe it was roughly, or it was over $2 million a month. He also was accused of funding several other terrorist groups, including Al-Shabaab, including Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, including Asbat al-Ansar, and also allegedly to Ayman al-Zawahiri's representative in Syria as well. He also played a prominent role in several other organizations. He was chairman of a think tank in Qatar, which has hosted US-sanctioned terrorist operatives before, and which reportedly has received state funds from the Qatari government. He funded an extremist group called the Global Anti-Aggression Coalition, which I believe is under sanctions by the United Arab Emirates as a terrorist organization, if I recall correctly. And he also was co-founder of a Geneva-based so-called rights group called Al-Karama, which frequently advocates for radical Islamist prisoners and claims that they're prisoners of conscience, even in some instances, individuals that turn out to have been Al-Qaeda funders, unfortunately. Whether it's at the time or after the fact, I can't recall which. But so he was sanctioned by the US in 2013. He was sanctioned, I believe, by the United Nations in 2014. Even Turkey, Qatar's ally, sanctioned him. The European Union, I believe, sanctioned him. But news reports suggested that he was still a free man in Qatar. And there was a Twitter account which was attributed to him in an article by an American journalist named Eli Lake. And that Twitter account is still active today.
Qatar says they have imposed travel bans on Qataris designated as terrorists.
Yes.
What happened in the case of alMairi, who was released from Guantanamo on the condition that he would not be allowed to travel outside of Qatar, and he was deported there?
Yeah, so that's one of several problematic cases in this regard. So Jarallah alMairi was held at Guantanamo for a number of years. He was captured in South Asia, and according to the Guantanamo case files regarding his case, was described as thought to be an al-Qaeda operative, thought to be a courier for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks for al-Qaeda. And alMairi was ultimately repatriated to Qatar at request of the Qatari government. Part of the terms for that repatriation was an agreement from the Qatari side that he would not be allowed to travel internationally, and that if he attempted to do so, the United States would be swiftly notified. However, he was detained in Britain, having traveled there not once but twice, without the United States having previously been notified by the government of Qatar. When the U.S. brought this up with Qatari law enforcement officials, they were reportedly told, well, we're not bound by it because it wasn't a judicial accord agreement or something, some specific term, to suggest that any sort of other agreement doesn't need to be honored by the state of Qatar, which is outrageous. This is not the only instance in which Qatar has failed in its commitments in this regard. For example, another individual suspected of terror finance is a guy named Khalifa al-Subai, who was sanctioned by the United States in 2008, I believe after he was convicted in absentia by a Bahraini court, and then sanctioned also by the United Nations on charges of terror finance as well, funding al-Qaeda. He, after his US sanctioning, he was detained by Qatari authorities for a number of months, and then let go, apparently without any charges having been pressed against him. Now, after this whole controversy, which happened at about the same time as this Jarallah alMairi episode with the travel, the US government was pushing Qatar a little bit more than it had in the past on these terror finance related issues behind the scenes. And the United States reported in a purported US cable that was released through WikiLeaks that they were assured by the Qatari government that Subai was under control, that he was under supervision, that he had all his bank accounts shut down except one that would be heavily controlled by the central government, by the central bank. Now, if you fast forward several years, in 2014, when the US sanctioned several individuals linked to Qatari territory on charges of terror finance, it mentioned with regard to two of these individuals that they had worked with Subai after this whole past episode. They had worked with him in 2012. So 3 years after Qatar had said this guy would be under control, that these individuals had worked with Subai to fund core al-Qaeda leaders in South Asia. Now, that to me suggests that Qatar failed to live up to its commitment to keep this guy under control. One other truly outrageous episode, if what we're seeing tracks with the truth, is the case of Farouk al-Qahtani al-Qatari. This is a guy who was killed by the US in a drone strike in eastern Afghanistan in late 2016. Several months before that, the US sanctioned Qahtani, saying that he was fundraising from Gulf countries and was, or from donors in the Gulf, rather, and that he was a key al-Qaeda leader, an emir of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, who not only was involved in attacks against coalition forces in Afghanistan, but had been plotting external operations for al-Qaeda, meaning foreign terror attacks against the American homeland as well as against other Western countries. Farouk al-Ghahtani was described by Michael Morell, the former acting director of the Central Intelligence Agency, as the one terrorist in South Asia that Morell worried the most about, even more than Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now, when the Treasury Department of the US sanctioned Ghahtani in early 2016, it revealed his full name, Nayef al-Hababi, and it listed many of his middle names as well. And based on that information, I was able to determine that it appears as though he may have previously been detained by the Qatari government.
I read your article.
Yeah.
I remember reading it very clearly, and I was shocked that he was actually in Qatar, very close to the American base, and he was allowed to leave. Am I correct?
So it appears that he was he may have been detained it was 2005 or 2006, I think, held for a number of months, reportedly on the in the control of Qatari intelligence services. So not an ordinary prisoner or anything. Not allowed to speak to a lawyer. Eventually released without any charges pressed. And then issued a new passport within the year.
This takes me to my next question.
If it is the same individual, yeah.
Can you tell me some cases of Qataris or designated terrorists who were granted Qatari passports and were able to leave Qatar and go some other countries?
Well, I mean, perhaps the most notable case, someone designated as a terrorist by Egypt, by Saudi, by the United Arab Emirates, and by Bahrain is Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Now, it should be noted that he's not designated as a terrorist by the United States. However, the former Deputy National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush wrote that there was serious consideration of sanctioning Qaradawi under the Bush administration, and ultimately that they chose not to do so. Although it's not clear whether they chose not to do so because they felt the evidence wasn't there or because they felt he was too politically sensitive. I don't know. But Qaradawi reportedly bragged to the Qatari press subsequently that he would have been sanctioned by the United States if not for the intercession of the Qatari emir at the time on his behalf. Qaradawi was the chairman of an entity called Union of the Good, which was sanctioned by the US Treasury Department on charges of being a front for terrorist finance.
The US asked the former Foreign Minister, Hamad bin Jassim, to help them arrest Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks in the US. What happened, and did he stall?
So, my understanding is that when the US requested to deal with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was an employee of the Qatari government at the time, despite not being a Qatari national, and was able to travel extensively out of Qatar while still supposedly being in the employ of the government. He allegedly was cited at the compound of one of the Qatari ministers, and has actually been determined at that time when he was traveling in Southeast Asia to be involved in a major al-Qaeda plot. The Bojinka airliner plot is what it's called, in which al-Qaeda allegedly tried something like 9/11, where they were hoping to hijack a number of airliners and use them in terrorist attacks. The United States told the Qatari government that they were very concerned about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and that they wanted to arrest him. Arrangements were made for the US to send a team to Qatar to capture KSM, as he's called, his abbreviation, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, to capture KSM. But by the time they got there, he was gone. News reports have alleged that he was thought to have been tipped off by someone in the Qatari government. News reports have alleged that he was given a new passport. And news reports have also alleged that he left on a private Qatari plane.
On what basis was the former Qatari Interior Minister designated as a terrorist by the Arab states in the recent list?
So the former Qatari Interior Minister was designated by the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia based on allegations that he had provided support logistical comfort to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed while he was in Qatar before he fled Qatar. He also had an estate on which a number of Afghan Arab veterans allegedly stayed or were cited.
Aziz al-Atiyah, the cousin of the current defense minister and the brother of Hamad al-Atiyah, the advisor to Sheikh Tamim, was convicted in Lebanon on a tip from the American and the British government for funding al-Nusra. Where is he today?
So, to the best of my knowledge, Abdulaziz al-Atiyah is in Qatar today. He was detained in Lebanon in 2012 for several days, and then reportedly as a result of pressure from the Qatari government, Lebanon released him. He was allowed to travel home to Qatar. A Lebanese cabinet minister said that he's back in Qatar. He then received an award the year later from the Qatari Olympic Committee for lifetime achievements in sport. The Qatar Olympic Committee was chaired at that time by Tamim al-Thani, the now emir. Additionally, a Twitter account that was linked to al-Atiyah in his designation by the four Arab states, that he appeared to be in a video with Sa'ad bin Sa'ad al-Ka'abi, I think it was in 2013, in which Wagdi Ghanem, another individual sanctioned by the four Arab states this past month, praised al-Ka'abi's fundraising campaign, which was called Madad Ahl al-Sham. Now, wouldn't you know it, 2 years later, Madad Ahl al-Sham's two of its leaders, al-Ka'abi and another individual, Abdul al-Kawari, were sanctioned by the US and then by the United Nations on charges of using charitable fundraising activities as a front for funding al-Qaeda in Syria and beyond.
The Arab states have released a list of individuals sanctioned as terrorists, which includes the name of Abdul Hakim Belhaj from Libya. Yeah. Why him?
Belhaj was thought to be the longtime leader of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, a radical militia in Libya, which the United States government said was affiliated with al-Qaeda. Belhaj left. He was reportedly tortured in an intelligence base. He later returned to Libya after Gaddafi was in trouble, led some of the fighters against him. Now, Belhaj and his fighters were reported to be heavy favorites of the Qatari government, big recipients of Qatari support in that armed conflict against the Gaddafi regime, as well as friends of Qatar after the Gaddafi regime fell. It's alleged that by the four Arab states that sanctioned him, that he is involved in terrorism, and several other entities or individuals in Libya that are thought to be close to Qatar were also sanctioned by those four states as well.
Do you think Qatar will expel Hamas leaders, and are they actively operating from inside Doha?
So it was reported in late 2014 or early 2015 as a result of the pressure on Qatar from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain at that time, that Khalid Mashal was going to be leaving and moving to Turkey. And that perhaps other Hamas officials would leave as well, and that two Hamas financiers were being detained by Qatar but then were let go. Now, King Abdullah died of Saudi Arabia, and as a result, the pressure on Qatar was released. And so the Hamas financiers in prison in Qatar were reportedly freed very soon afterwards, and Meshal didn't have to leave for Turkey and was able to stay in Qatar. Now, if you fast forward to the current dispute, there are reports that a small handful of Hamas officials in Qatar have been asked to leave. Now, the news outlet that reported this said that it was only those Hamas operatives that are involved in West Bank operations. So not the political leadership, which does claim to have some oversight over military matters, not the PR operatives, not other members of Hamas, just this small subset. But even of that small subset, which were the ones that were expelled were reportedly sent to Lebanon or Malaysia or back to Turkey. But even of that small category of individuals linked to West Bank terrorist operations against civilians or against military forces, not all of them appear to have been kicked out. So Hossam Badran is a spokesperson for Hamas, but he's also been accused by Israeli security services of funding and directing a West Bank terrorist cell that was planning terrorist attacks. One would think that if he were indeed involved in such activities that he also would have been asked to leave, but he doesn't appear to have been. Further, folks like Meshal still appear to be in place. So, this seems at most a cosmetic action, moving some of the pieces around, but not a fundamental change in Qatar's relationship with Hamas. Now, Egypt for a time described Hamas as a terrorist organization. That's been, I believe, undone. The United Arab Emirates' foreign minister, I have heard describe Hamas as terrorist, but he's not listed as terrorist by the UAE or by Saudi or Bahrain. So one thing that these four states might be considering right now would be adding Hamas as a terrorist organization, especially given that it's backed by Iran, that it tries to target civilians as well. So not a commentary on the Palestinians, the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, which understandably deserves support, but rather a comment on Hamas's methods and backing as terroristic activities, something that could increase the pressure in Qatar, especially if it's paired with a description of which Hamas operatives are still in Qatar today.
Where is the dialogue in Washington, D.C. about the possibility of designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, considering that they are affiliates of Hamas who are designated as terrorists here?
Yeah. So the discussion has moved a lot since Trump was elected president. It went from a bill in Congress that was unlikely to pass and unlikely to be supported by the executive branch to something that's thought to be under serious consideration. Now, the challenge with the Muslim Brotherhood is that it clearly has an extremist ideology and extremist goals, and in many instances, extremist methods. But it's also a very big network with a lot of different branches. And so many in Washington believe that parts of the Brotherhood are clearly engaged in terrorism, and that parts of it may not meet the bar of what the US law has for terrorism, which is that every branch be actively choosing to engage in attacks against civilians, which you can certainly make a case for a number of Brotherhood branches, but not all of them may fit that US legal criteria. And so there's a consideration of mandating a very serious investigation of every single one of the Brotherhood's branches, with the direction that they all should be designated if they meet that legal criteria, and that for those that don't meet the US legal criteria, that they should be opposed with all measures of American power in other ways. And so that's something that I think the Trump administration supports. That's something that I think will also be able to pass in this Congress. And so that's probably the form that's likely to proceed probably in the next few months.
Does the U.S. understand that the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas are faces of the same coin?
Absolutely. And I think that's part of what convinces some legislators who don't necessarily understand that much about the Brotherhood. It helps them understand it a little bit more, absolutely. And by the way, I should note that this is a connection that the Qatari government has tried to hide. This is something that Qatar claims that it doesn't support the Brotherhood at all, which is unbelievable. But you saw the amount of support that Qatar provided to the Morsi government relative to the Sisi government, right? Even just several weeks ago, Qatar was host to a press conference for Hamas, which was focused on rebranding Hamas. In the same way that Qatar reportedly was involved with trying to persuade Jabhat al-Nusra to change its face without necessarily changing its extremism. So Qatar claimed, Hamas claimed in its Doha press conference that it has nothing to do with the Brotherhood. But we all know that that's not true. We all know where Hamas's roots come from, and we all know where Hamas's ideological sympathies lie.
You present open source reports to the U.S. Treasury Department. Yeah. You meet with the officials. What mechanisms and tools do they rely on in their investigation? Well,
the Treasury Department works with other branches of the U.S. government. It works with foreign governments as well. In the past, it's had to be a decision by the president to impose sanctions on people or organizations that fund terrorism. Now we want to make this a more systematic part of U.S. policy, and therefore we authorize Treasury, and in some instances the State Department, to sanction terrorists and terror financiers of their own initiative, provided the White House signs off on it. So as a result, it created an infrastructure that enables the bureaucracy to do a lot of the research and to make these proposals in a way where a lot more sanctions are able to happen. But I should note that it's not only these sanctions against individuals or against specific entities that are tools in the U.S. toolkit. So, for example, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Ed Royce, recently said that if Qatar doesn't change its behavior, he and other members of Congress will consider advocating removing U.S. forces from the airbase at Al Udeid in Qatar. But he also said that he was introducing legislation that would require sanctions on any entity or government that provides material support to Hamas. So that's something that could cause significant consequences for Qatar if it does so. Additionally, there is a law called the Export Administration Act of 1979. And what that law says, among other things, is with regard to counterterrorism, if any country knowingly allows its territory to be a safe haven for operatives of terrorist groups, as Qatar has reportedly done for quite some time, then the Secretary of State may list that country as doing so, and which would require new restrictions on certain U.S. trade with Qatar unless the U.S. provides special licenses.
Well, there are currently 3 countries now designated as sponsors of terrorism: Iran, Syria, and Sudan. Yeah. Do you think Qatar would be designated officially as a sponsor of terrorism if it continues in this path?
You know, it's an especially interesting question from you, given that we were talking at an open conference several weeks ago, and you asked me that, and I said on camera, never, ever, 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 or something like that.
And I was shocked, but I'm asking you this question again today, after these developments. What do you say to that?
Right. I think it's appropriate to be asking again because of what President Trump said on Friday. He said something that I never thought any American president would publicly say. He said that Qatar, as a nation at very high levels, is a funder of terrorism. Now, presuming he meant that regarding the government of Qatar and not just the people of some people in Qatar, that would mean that if his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, listens to that and uses that as a basis for the annual determination of which governments are state sponsors of terror, that would probably mean that Qatar would get designated.
One of the main demands the Arab countries have placed on the table is the closure of the Al Jazeera channel.
Yes.
Why?
What many may not realize when they listen to it is that it's serving the agenda, in many instances, of Qatari rulers, as well as, in many instances, the agenda of the Ikhwan and other radical extremists. So the State Department, the U.S. State Department, stated quite recently that, in a report, that Al Jazeera is not just funded by the government of Qatar, but it is owned by the government of Qatar. the problems with Al Jazeera are numerous. Every single time someone tries to kill an Israeli civilian in the name of national liberation, but tries to kill an Israeli civilian, virtually every single time that I have ever seen, Al Jazeera calls that person a shaheed, calls that person a martyr. And that's separate from instances in which those individuals are trying to target police or other security forces or military. There's a different debate to be had about that. Additionally, this sort of language was used in many instances to describe insurgents that were trying to topple the government in Iraq and trying to kill coalition forces that included, in large amounts, American forces. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who was just sanctioned by the 4 Arab states that are leading the charge against Qatar's bad practices, also issued statements encouraging attacks against Americans.
And Qaradawi, as I understand, was granted the Qatari citizenship as well.
Yes, he is a naturalized citizen by Qatar. He has reportedly become a very rich man because of land grants allowed to him by the Qatari rulers. He's been there for half a century and was a favorite preacher, reportedly, of Khalifa bin Hamad al-Thani, the grandfather emir who passed away recently, as well as of Hamad bin Khalifa al-Thani, the now father emir, who allowed him to become an international extremist star on Al Jazeera. And he was, I believe, present at the coronation of Tamim bin Hamad al-Thani. And indeed, just the very day that Egypt and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates severed their relations with Qatar this year, the emir hosted Qaradawi at his palace. He kissed him, he held him, he gave him the seat of honor next to him, something that he's done numerous times before. And this just shows you where the Qatari leadership thinks their sympathies should lie. And it's wrong, and it needs to stop.
Dr. Weinberg, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you for your interest in this issue.